The world knows his name, but the world forgets his tears. The Prophet Muhammad was not born into ease, nor did he rise to leadership through comfort. He entered this world as an orphan. His father passed away before he could see him. His mother died when he was only 6 years old, leaving him to face life with nothing but the care of a grandfather, and later, an uncle. Loss came early, and it came often. In the harsh deserts of Arabia, survival was a daily battle. Poverty was not an idea, it was reality. Yet even in his youth, those around him noticed something different. He was honest when lying was easy, gentle when harshness was the norm. They called him Al-Amin, the trustworthy. Long before he spoke a single word of revelation, but trustworthiness does not shield you from pain. As a young man, he saw injustice everywhere. Women treated as property, the poor ignored, the strong crushing the weak. His heart felt the weight of this cruelty. According to the Quran in Surah Al-Anbiya 21-107, Allah describes him as a mercy to all the worlds. Mercy was not just a message he preached. It was the air he breathed. Even when surrounded by people who misunderstood him, when the first revelation came in the cave of Hira, it did not arrive with applause. It arrived with fear and uncertainty. He returned home shaking, telling his wife Khadijah, "Cover me, cover me." This was the beginning of a mission that would break his body, test his spirit, and yet fill the world with light. From the moment he began calling people to worship one God, the insults began. In Mecca, the mission was not met with curiosity. It was met with resistance that grew more violent with each passing year. The leaders of Quraysh feared losing power, wealth, and the control they held over the people through idol worship. They could not silence his words with reason, so they tried to silence them with force. The followers of the Prophet faced torture, exile, and even death. Families were torn apart. Bilal, a slave who embraced Islam, was dragged through the streets and pinned under heavy stones under the scorching sun. Ordered to renounce his faith, his only reply was a Haji Juan affirming the oneness of God. Others, like Sumaya, the first female martyr of Islam, were killed for refusing to betray the truth they had found. And yet, the Prophet did not retaliate with violence in those early years. He taught patience. He reminded them that Allah was with those who endured. According to the Quran in Surah Ashar 94-5-6, Allah says, "Indeed, with hardship comes ease. Indeed, with hardship comes ease." These words became a lifeline, not just a verse. They were a promise that the storm would not last forever, but storms have many shapes. When the Quraysh could not break their faith, they tried to break their bodies. They enforced a social boycott. No one could trade with Mary or even speak to the Muslims. For 3 long years, the weight of Mecca's hostility grew heavier by the day. When every door in his own city closed to him, the Prophet Muhammad turned his eyes toward a new horizon. An opportunity came from Yathrib, a city later known as Medina. 2 tribes there, tired of their endless conflicts, invited him to be a mediator, someone who could bring unity where there had only been division. Leaving Mecca was not a simple decision. This was his birthplace, the land where his ancestors were buried, but the safety of his followers came before his own attachment to the city. Quraysh leaders plotted to kill him in his sleep, but by Allah's will, he escaped under the cover of night. In his place, his cousin Ali lay in his bed, risking his life so the Prophet could leave. The journey to Medina, the Hijra, was more than a migration. It was a line in history dividing persecution from the beginning of a new society. Yet even in this moment of escape, he held no hatred in his heart for those who had tried to end his life. He entered Medina not as a conqueror but as a servant leader, building bonds between the emigrants from Mecca and the native residents. One of his first acts was to build a masjid, not just as a place of worship, but as the center of the community, a place where disputes were settled, the poor were fed, and strangers were welcomed. He drafted the Constitution of Medina, a document granting rights and responsibilities to Muslims, Jews, and other groups in the city, showing that his leadership was rooted in justice, not dominance. But Medina was not free from trials. The Quraysh would not let him live in peace. Battles became unavoidable. Badr, Uhud, the trench. Each one a test of faith, courage, and mercy. Even in victory, he never gloated. Even in loss, he never despaired. As the years in Medina passed, the mission of the Prophet Muhammad continued to grow, but so did the weight of responsibility. Every decision he made could save lives or cost them. Every word he spoke could heal a heart or harden it forever. And yet, even under that pressure, he never let power change the gentleness in his character. There was a day when a Bedouin man entered the masjid, pulled the Prophet's cloak so roughly that it left a mark on his neck, and demanded charity in a harsh tone. In that moment, many leaders would have responded with anger, but the Prophet simply smiled, ordered that the man be given what he needed, and reminded his companions that kindness is not given because someone deserves it. It is given because Allah loves those who give. He was not only a messenger in the spiritual sense, he was a messenger of how to live with honor, even toward those who disrespect you. According to the Quran, In Surah Al-Furqan 25-63, Allah describes the servants of the Most Merciful as those who walk upon the earth easily, and when the ignorant address them harshly, they say words of peace. This verse was not theory for him, it was his daily practice. The Prophet's compassion extended beyond his followers. Once, a Jewish funeral procession passed by, and he stood up in respect. When questioned, he replied, "Was he not a human soul?" In those words lies a truth our modern world still struggles to embrace. That dignity belongs to every human being, regardless of belief. But perhaps one of the most powerful displays of his character came in the conquest of Mecca after 2 years of persecution, exile, and war. He returned to the city not with an army. As the mission neared its completion, the Prophet Muhammad knew his time on earth was limited. Revelation had guided him through years of loss and victory, exile and return. But now, the message was almost complete, and the people had embraced Islam across Arabia. Still, his heart never grew distant from the struggles of those around him. In the final year of his life, during the farewell pilgrimage, he stood before more than 100,000 believers on the plains of Arafat. The sun was relentless, yet his voice carried with clarity, not to glorify himself, but to leave guidance for generations to come. He reminded them of the sanctity of life, the equality of all people, the rights of women, and the importance of holding fast to the Quran and his teachings. According to the Quran and Surah Al-Ma'idah 5-3, Allah revealed on that day, "This day I have perfected for you your religion, and completed my favor upon you, and have approved for you Islam as your religion." It was a moment of divine completion, yet his message remained grounded in mercy, justice, and love. Soon after returning to Medina, his health began to decline, even in illness. After the Prophet Muhammad returned to his Lord, the world he left behind was forever changed. His companions, men and women who had walked beside him, fought beside him, and learned at his side, carried his message into lands far beyond Arabia, but they did not only carry his words, they carried his way. This was the true miracle of his leadership, that it lived on in the hearts of ordinary people. They remembered how he spoke gently to the weakest among them, how he listened to the concerns of the poor, how he smiled even when life was heavy. They remembered that when power rested in his hands, he chose mercy over dominance, forgiveness over revenge. And this legacy was not built in the moments of ease, it was built in the long nights of prayer when his feet would swell, and Aisha would ask, "Why do you pray so much when Allah has already forgiven you?" His answer was simple, "Should I not be a grateful servant?" According to the Quran, in Surah Al-Qalam, 68-4, Allah says, "And indeed, you are of a great moral character." This was not a praise for his knowledge alone, but for the way he lived, treated, and loved people, even those who wronged him. In the years after his passing, stories of his kindness spread faster than the borders of the Muslim world. A man who once plotted against him would later embrace Islam, not because of the Prophet Muhammad's life was not a tale of distant perfection. It was the story of a man who felt hunger, who grieved for the people he lost, who faced betrayal from those he had once trusted, and yet, he never allowed these wounds to darken his heart. That is why his example continues to reach across centuries, cultures, and languages. He lived in a society where tribal pride and vengeance ruled. To forgive someone was seen as weakness. To show kindness to an enemy was considered foolish. Yet time after time, he chose the path that seemed impossible. When a man who had tried to kill him was brought before him, the Prophet did not seek revenge. He let him go free. When a woman who had cursed him was found in need, he gave her food with his own hands. These moments were not accidents, they were lessons. He showed that real strength is not in the ability to break others, but in the ability to restrain yourself when you have every reason and every power to strike back. According to the Quran, in Surah Fusilat 41-34, Allah says, "Good and evil are not equal. Repel evil with what is better, and your enemy will become as close as a devoted friend." This was the method the Prophet lived by, not just in public, but in the quiet corners of his life where only Allah. The Prophet Muhammad's ability to balance mercy with justice was unlike anything his people had seen before. He was not a leader who ignored wrongs, but he was also not one who allowed justice to become an excuse for cruelty. Every judgment he made was rooted in fairness, guided by revelation, and softened by compassion. There was a time when a woman from a noble family committed a theft. Some among the companions thought her status might protect her from the prescribed punishment, but the Prophet made it clear, the law applied to everyone equally. He said, "If my own daughter Fatima were to steal, I would cut off her hand." His firmness was not born from harshness, but from the belief that justice is only true when it is applied without favoritism. And yet, that same man would shorten his prayers when he heard a child crying in the masjid, so as not to cause distress to the mother. He would kneel in the street to play with children, call them by name, and make them feel seen in a world that often ignored the young. According to the Quran in Surah An-Nahl 16-90, Allah commands, "Indeed Allah orders justice and good conduct in giving to relatives, and forbids immorality, bad conduct, and oppression." This verse was not just part of his speech, it was stitched into the way he lived. The Prophet Muhammad knew the weight of loneliness. Before the world called him messenger, before Medina welcomed him, he spent years as a man whose message was met with suspicion, ridicule, and hostility. Friends turned away, neighbors avoided him. Those he loved most were mocked simply for standing by him. In Mecca, the boycott was one of the hardest trials he faced. For 3 long years, he and his companions were confined to a barren valley, cut off from trade, food, and support. The cries of hungry children echoed in the night. Leaves and dried grass became their meals. Many of his companions fell sick, and yet he continued to lead prayers, to speak words of hope, to remind them that this suffering had meaning. And then came the year the scholars call Am al-Hazan, the year of sorrow. In a short span of time, he lost both Abu Talib, his uncle who had protected him, and Khadijah, his beloved wife, and source of emotional strength. The home that had once been filled with laughter and comfort now felt unbearably quiet. Yet even in this grief, he did not let bitterness take root in his heart. According to the Quran in Surah Ashar 94:25-26, for indeed, with hardship comes ease. Indeed, with hardship comes ease. The repetition was not by accident, it was a divine reminder that no pain is permanent, and every trial carries the seed of relief. The Prophet's way of dealing with pain was not to pretend it didn't exist, but to lean into patience and trust. He allowed himself to weep, but he never let despair control him. When Taif rejected him, and its people threw stones until his sandals filled with blood, he prayed not for their destruction, but for their guidance. It's easy to admire such strength from a distance, but his story is not meant to be untouchable, it's an invitation. We too face betrayals, rejections, and losses that make the world feel small and cold. But his life shows us that the answer is not to shut down, but to rise again with kindness still in our hands. The world will tell you to harden after pain. He showed us how to stay soft, and still remain unbreakable. When the Prophet Muhammad entered Medina after the Hijrah, it was not as a conqueror taking a throne, but as a servant carrying a mission. The city had been torn by years of tribal disputes, and yet, within a short time, he united them under a shared vision of justice, compassion, and faith. His first act was to build a mosque, not a palace. It was a place where the rich and poor sat side by side, where travelers found shelter, and where community decisions were made openly. He showed that leadership was not about ruling over people, but serving them. But leadership also brought new challenges. Medina became a target for attacks. Hypocrites worked to create division from within. Outside forces tried to break the unity he had built. Yet, in every conflict, he remained guided by principle, never revenge. Even in war, he prohibited the killing of children, the elderly, and the destruction of crops or places of worship. Rules that were revolutionary in an age of brutality. According to Sahih al-Bukhari, he said, "The leader of a people is their servant." These were not empty words. His life was proof. He mended his own clothes, milked his own goats, and sat on the ground among his companions as an equal. His kindness was not selective. He visited the sick, regardless of whether they were Muslim or not. He stood in respect during a funeral procession for a Jewish man, and when someone questioned why, he replied, "The Prophet Muhammad's life was not free from betrayal, even among those who smiled in his presence. Some harbored envy and plotted against him." Hypocrites in Medina spread rumors, tried to fracture the unity of the Muslims, and even undermined him during critical moments of battle. One of the most painful incidents was the slander against his wife, Seerah. False accusations spread quickly, and whispers began to hurt the Prophet deeply. For weeks, there was no revelation to clear her name. Imagine the weight, the pain of knowing that people you lead, people you pray with, might believe lies about the person you love most. But even here, his example was remarkable. He did not lash out blindly or seek revenge against every voice of doubt. He waited with patience, turned to Allah in prayer, and when the truth was revealed in the Quran, he addressed the community with dignity, restoring unity without vengeance. According to the Quran in Surah An-Nur 24-19, "Indeed, those who like that immorality should be spread among the believers will have a painful punishment in this world and the hereafter." This was not just a warning about slander, it was a lesson on the power of our words to build or destroy. Even with his enemies, he showed restraint. There were moments when those who had harmed him fell into his hands, and yet he forgave them. When Abdullah ibn Ubay, the leader of the hypocrites, died, the Prophet even prayed for him, despite his deep betrayal. In our own lives, betrayal often put. The battles the Prophet Muhammad faced were not only fought with swords, many were battles of the heart, testing patience, endurance, and trust in Allah. Among them, the Battle of Uhud stands as a moment of both pain and profound teaching. At Uhud, the Muslims initially had the upper hand, but a group of archers disobeyed his instruction, leaving their post to gather spoils. This opened the door for the enemy to counterattack. The tide turned swiftly, and chaos spread across the battlefield. The Prophet himself was struck, his helmet crushing into his cheek, his lip bleeding, and his tooth broken. Imagine the messenger of Allah, injured, surrounded by enemies. And yet his first words were not of anger, but of concern for his people. He raised his hands and prayed, "O Allah, forgive my people, for they do not know." His pain was not just from wounds, it was from seeing lives lost due to disobedience and misunderstanding. The Quran addressed this in Surah Ali Imran 3-159. So by mercy from Allah, O Muhammad, you were lenient with them, and if you had been harsh and hard-hearted, they would have dispersed from around you. So pardon them and ask forgiveness for them. This was leadership at its purest. Even when his followers made mistakes that cost dearly, he did not humiliate them or hold it over their heads. He forgave, taught, and moved forward. Uhud was also a reminder that faith is not a shield from hardship. Even the most beloved to Allah was not spared loss, injury, or grief. Instead, hardship became the classroom where lessons of trust, humility, and unity were taught. In life, we often think that one of the most defining traits of Prophet Muhammad was his unmatched generosity and compassion for the poor, the orphans, and those society ignored. He was not a man of wealth by the end of his life, even though power and resources had come into his hands. Instead, whatever he received, he gave away. It is narrated that he never said no to anyone who asked him for something. Once a man came seeking help, and the Prophet gave him so much that the man returned to his tribe, declaring, "O my people, accept Islam, for Muhammad gives like a man who has no fear of poverty." According to the Quran, in Surah Ade, Duha'a 93, Bonding 10. So do not oppress the orphan, and do not repel the beggar. These were not just words he preached, they were commands he lived. In Medina, when food was scarce, he would often give away what little he had, sometimes going hungry himself. Even during times of personal loss, his generosity never stopped. When his daughter Fatima asked for a servant to help her with the household work, he gave her words of dhikr, instead, reminding her that spiritual strength was greater than physical help. One moving example was during the famine in Medina. A man came to him saying, "I am hungry." The Prophet sent word to his wives to see if there was food in any of their homes. Each one replied, "Nothing but water." So the Prophet asked his companions, "Who will host this man tonight?" One companion volunteered, taking the guest home, dimming the lamp, and pretending to eat so the guest could have the meal. When the Prophet learned of this, he smiled and recited the verse from Surah Al-Hashr 59-9, praising those who give to others, even when they themselves are in need. In a world where leadership often means accumulating power and wealth, the Prophet's life was the opposite. His richness was perhaps one of the most profound aspects of Prophet Muhammad's life was how he dealt with forgiveness, especially toward those who had caused him the deepest pain. Nowhere was this more evident than during the conquest of Mecca. For years, the Quraysh had mocked him, called him a liar, plotted his assassination, driven him from his home, and waged wars against him. Many of his companions had been tortured or killed at their hands. And yet, when the Muslims entered Mecca victorious after years of persecution, there was no revenge, no mass punishment. The Prophet stood before the very people who had once forced him to leave in the dark of night and asked them, "What do you think I will do to you today?" Trembling, they replied, "You are a noble brother, and the son of a noble brother." His answer was simple yet world-changing: "Go, for you are free." No king, no general, no leader in history had offered such mercy at such a moment of complete power. There was no public humiliation, no executions for old enemies. Instead, he forgave, erased the hatred of the past, and rebuilt the city on the foundation of justice and faith. According to Surah Yusuf 12-92, the words he used echoed those of Prophet Yusuf Joseph when forgiving his brothers. "No blame will there be upon you." As the life of Prophet Muhammad drew to its final chapter, his mission was complete. From a lone man in Mecca, mocked and rejected, he had become the leader of a united people, guiding them with faith, justice, and compassion. But even in his last days, his heart was not on himself. It was on his ummah. He fell ill not long after delivering his farewell sermon at the plains of Hira, a speech that stands as a timeless charter of human rights and dignity. In it, he reminded the people, all mankind is from Adam and Eve. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor does a non-Arab have superiority over an Arab, except by piety and good action. His words cut through centuries of tribal arrogance, laying the foundation for equality before God. As his illness worsened, he led the prayer whenever he could, sometimes supported by 2 companions, because he was too weak to stand alone. Yet he still reminded those around him, prayer, prayer, and what your right hands possess, urging care for worship and for those under one's responsibility. On his final day, he drew back the curtain from his room and looked upon the rows of his companions in prayer. A faint smile appeared on his face, as if satisfied to see them united in worship. Then he lowered the curtain. The legacy of Prophet Muhammad is not just in the historical records, the mosques, or the expansion of a faith. It lives in the small, everyday acts that mirror his character. His kindness to strangers, his gentleness with children, his humility, even as the leader of a vast nation, his tears and prayer in the stillness of the night. All of these are pieces of his legacy that can be carried into every generation. What made his influence so enduring was not wealth or military power, but the purity of his example. He showed that leadership is not about commanding obedience, but inspiring hearts. He proved that love, when anchored in truth, is more unshakable than fear. His teachings continue to inspire every sphere of life, from governance and justice to family relations and business ethics. He taught fairness in trade, urging honesty over profit. He taught men and women to respect one another, parents to cherish their children, and rulers to see themselves as servants of the people. One of the most beautiful aspects of his legacy is how accessible it is. You don't have to be a scholar, a warrior, or a ruler to follow his example. Smiling at someone is charity. Removing harm from a path is charity. Speaking kindly is charity. His way transformed worship from something limited to rituals into something woven into daily life. And this is perhaps why when we look at the life of Prophet Muhammad from beginning to end, one truth becomes clear. His entire journey was a test of the heart. From losing his parents as a child, to enduring years of ridicule in Mecca, to carrying the heavy burden of divine revelation. Every chapter was a test that shaped him into the man who could guide nations. He was a leader who felt the pain of his people deeply. When famine struck, he tied stones to his stomach to share in their hunger. When someone insulted him, he prayed for them instead of seeking revenge. When his companions made mistakes, he corrected them with patience rather than humiliation. His leadership was rooted in empathy. He saw every follower not as a number, but as a soul. And it wasn't only Muslims who experienced his mercy. The Jews of Medina found in him a just arbiter for their disputes. Even enemies who plotted against him were shown forgiveness if they sought peace. The Treaty of Hudaybiyah stands as a testament to his strategic wisdom and his preference for peace over war. Even when his companions struggled to understand it at first, his vision was always bigger than the moment. He planted seeds for a civilization. As the Prophet's mission neared its end, his focus was not on himself, but on the people he loved and the message he carried. Even in his final days, his heart was heavy with concern. Had he fulfilled his duty? Had he conveyed the message clearly enough? Had he done everything he could to guide his ummah toward the path of truth? In his last public sermon, delivered during the farewell pilgrimage, he stood before a sea of believers and summarized a lifetime of guidance in a few simple, profound words. He reminded them that their lives, wealth, and honor were sacred. He abolished all remnants of pre-Islamic injustice. He emphasized the equality of all people, Arab or non-Arab, black or white, and tied it all to the fear of God and righteousness. He ended that sermon by asking the crowd, "Have I?" In the days following the Prophet's passing, Medina felt like a city without its heartbeat. The streets were quiet, not because there was nothing to say, but because every word felt too small to carry the weight of their loss. Men who had faced swords without fear now wept openly. Women who had once rushed to greet him after battle sat in silence, clutching their children. Even the orphans seemed to understand that the man who always noticed them, who always bent down to smile at them, was no longer there. But while grief filled the air, so did something else, an unshakable sense of responsibility. The companions knew that his mission was not meant to end with him. The Quran had been revealed, the teachings had been lived, and now it was their turn to carry the torch. Abu Bakr, now the first caliph, reminded everyone. As the years passed after the Prophet's departure from this world, his memory did not fade, it grew. Every story told about him, every verse he had recited, every act of kindness he had shown became part of a living legacy that crossed deserts, mountains, and seas. Those who had walked with him would sit in the shade of palm trees, sharing memories of his smile, his gentle humor, his courage in the face of danger. A single tear in their eyes could turn into a lesson for the next generation. They would say, "We saw him hungry, but he gave his food away. We saw him hurt, but he forgave. We saw him victorious, yet he remained humble." The message was clear. Leadership was not about titles or crowns, but about service. Love was not in words alone, but in sacrifice. Faith was not just belief, but action. His influence. The Prophet Muhammad's life was not a series of random events. It was a carefully guided journey filled with lessons for those who would come centuries later. And perhaps one of the most powerful examples came from a time of deep pain. The journey to Ta'if, the years of rejection in Mecca, after losing both Abu Talib, his protector, and Khadijah, his beloved wife. The Prophet traveled to Ta'if seeking support, but instead of open arms, he was met with insults. Stones were thrown at him until his feet bled. The streets echoed not with welcome, but with laughter and mockery. And yet, in that moment, a moment where anger would have been justified, he did something that stunned even the angels. He did not curse them, he prayed for them. His words were not for revenge, but for guidance. He asked Allah to forgive them, for they did not know the truth. This was the kind of leadership that made people trust him, not because he was untouchable, but because he could be hurt and still choose mercy over hatred. And here is where the what if reflection strikes. What if he had chosen to respond with anger that day? What if the people of Ta'if had been destroyed in that moment? Would Islam have spread to them later, as it eventually did? Or would an entire city have been erased from history's blessings? That single decision, to forgive rather than to retaliate, change the future of thousands of lives. It teaches us that sometimes the most powerful action is not what you do to others, but what you choose not to do. This is why people listened to him, not because he had armies at first, not because he forced them, but because his character was so pure that even those who hated him could not deny his honesty. And this is why his story still matters today. In our own if moments, when we are rejected, insulted, or mocked, we have a choice. To return hurt for hurt, or to walk away with dignity and pray for better days. The prophet's choice made history. Ours might make a difference in someone's future too. Years later, the same man who was driven out of Mecca, insulted in Taif, and hunted by enemies would return to Mecca, not as a fugitive, but as a leader. The conquest of Mecca was a moment the world had never seen before. Imagine it, the city that once plotted his death was now under his command. Tens of thousands stood ready, and with one word from him, Mecca could have been bathed in revenge. But when the people gathered before him, trembling, waiting for their punishment, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, asked, "What do you think I will do to you today?" Some replied cautiously, "You are a noble brother, the son of a noble brother." And then came the words that changed everything. "Go, you are free." No forced conversions, no mass executions, no humiliation. Instead, forgiveness became the flag of victory. This moment is more than history, it's leadership psychology at its highest form. True power is not in destroying your enemy, it's in giving them a reason to stand beside you. That day, many who once opposed him embraced Islam, not because they were afraid, but because they saw a man who could crush them and instead chose to lift them. And if we think about it in our own lives, we all have a Mecca to return to, a place, a group, or a moment where we were once wrong. How we act when we have the upper hand will decide the story people tell about us long after we are gone. Forgiveness, in the hands of the prophet, became a weapon stronger than any sword. And perhaps that's why even his enemies, when they spoke of him later, could not deny the truth of his heart. Among the most touching sides of the Prophet Muhammad's life was his kindness in the smallest details. Moments so gentle they could easily be missed in the grand sweep of history. He was a leader of nations, yet he would mend his own clothes, milk his own goat, and sit on the ground eating with the poor, as if no titles separated them. Children would run up to him without fear, grabbing his hand, walking him toward wherever they wanted to go, and he would go with them. When he spoke to someone, he turned his whole body toward them, making them feel as though they were the only person in the world. Even in his home, his kindness was constant. He would help with chores, patch torn garments, and never raise his voice in anger. This wasn't weakness. It was the strength of a man who could lead battles yet still smile at a child offering him a date. And there's a deeper truth here. The small acts are often the most remembered. We live in an age where grand gestures are posted online, but the Prophet's greatness was in the daily, unseen moments that stitched love into the hearts of those around him. What if leadership wasn't about making people feel your power, but about making them feel their worth? That was his way. It's why centuries later, people still speak of him not only as a messenger, but as the mercy to all worlds. A mercy that wasn't limited to speeches or laws, but poured into every interaction, every smile, and every word. The Prophet Muhammad's kindness did not stop with people. It extended to animals, the environment, and even to those who would never know his name. He taught that a woman was forgiven by Allah for giving water to a thirsty dog. He told of a man punished for starving a cat. He would stroke his camel's neck when it was tired, and once, upon seeing a bird distressed because its chicks were taken, he ordered the chicks to be returned to their mother immediately. In his eyes, life was sacred in every form. He warned against cutting down trees without need and reminded his followers that planting a seed was an act of charity, even if the world were to end tomorrow. This wasn't just compassion, it was a way of seeing the world as interconnected, where every act of care rippled into something greater. In leadership, this vision is rare. Too often, we measure success by what we gain, not by what we protect. But the Prophet saw it differently. To him, mercy wasn't a strategy, it was the foundation. And perhaps that's why his example still draws hearts. Because in a world where kindness is often traded for speed or profit, his life stands as proof that the most powerful leaders are those who protect even the smallest lives in their care. One of the most powerful lessons from the Prophet Muhammad's life came during the conquest of Mecca. After years of persecution, exile, battles, and betrayal, he finally returned to the city that had once driven him out. By all logic, this could have been the moment for revenge. But what did he do? He entered humbly, his head bowed on his camel, reciting words of praise to Allah. He did not burn the homes of his enemies. He did not punish them as they had punished him. Instead, he asked the Quraysh, "What do you think I will do with you?" They replied, "You are a noble brother, the son of a noble brother." And he said, "Go, for you are free." That single moment rewrote history. The people who once plotted his death now stood silent, overwhelmed by the mercy they had just witnessed. It showed the world that true strength is not in crushing your enemies, but in forgiving them. This is why, even centuries later, historians, leaders, and ordinary people alike return to this story, not for its military victory, but for the moral victory it represents. Because in the end, it is not power that outlives you, it is the way you used it. The Prophet Muhammad's leadership was not built on titles, wealth, or palaces. It was built on service. He mended his own clothes, milked his own goats, and swept the floor of his home. When people came to see him, they often couldn't tell who the Prophet was among his companions, because he sat on the ground like everyone else. He never built a throne for himself. Instead, he built space for others to rise. Once, a poor man entered the mosque and sat beside him. Nervously, the man's hands shook because he thought he was in the presence of a king. The Prophet smiled and reassured him, "I am not a king. I am the son of a woman who ate dried meat." These were not rehearsed lines for public image. They were the truth of his heart. He lived in such a way that no one felt too small to approach him. And in that simplicity, there is a timeless leadership lesson. The greatest leaders are not those who raise themselves above others, but those who bring themselves down to be with them. Because respect given out of fear fades quickly, but respect earned through humility lasts for generations. One of the most touching examples of the Prophet Muhammad's kindness was how he treated children. In a time when children were often overlooked, and daughters were sometimes seen as a burden, he transformed the culture with simple acts of love. When his daughter Fatima would enter the room, he would stand up, kiss her forehead, and seat her in his place. When he saw children playing in the streets, he would smile, call them by name, and sometimes join in their games. Even in the middle of a sermon, if his grandsons Hazen and Hussein came running, he would stop, pick them up, and hold them. He once carried them on his shoulders and told the people, "Whoever loves them, loves me." This tenderness was not just family affection, it was a public teaching. It told the community that love and mercy are not weaknesses, but strengths. And perhaps the most powerful lesson is this: if the Prophet of God could pause the most important moments to show affection to a child, then none of us are ever too busy to show kindness. The Prophet Muhammad's mercy was not limited to friends or family. It extended even to his enemies. After years of persecution, exile, and battles, he returned to Mecca at the head of an army. The people who had once mocked him, beaten his followers, and driven him out stood at his mercy. In that moment, many expected revenge. Instead, he asked them, "What do you think I will do to you today?" They replied, "You are a noble brother and the son of a noble brother." And he said the words that would echo through history: "Go, you are free. No prisons, no punishments, no humiliation." This was not weakness. It was strength at its highest form. It takes courage to fight, but it takes far greater courage to forgive when you have the power to punish. And here lies the lesson. The world remembers conquerors for their victories, but it remembers prophets for their mercy. The Prophet Muhammad also carried a deep concern for the poor, the hungry, and the forgotten. He knew what it felt like to be an orphan, to lose family, and to grow up without wealth. It is said that he never turned away a beggar empty-handed. If he had nothing material to give, he would offer words of comfort and a smile, which for many was worth more than gold. He often said, "The best of people are those who are most beneficial to others." At home, he lived simply. Days would pass without a cooked meal in his household, sometimes only dates and water. When food was served, he would never eat alone. He would call others to join, no matter how little there was. He reminded his followers, he is not a believer whose stomach is full while his neighbor goes hungry. This was not just charity, it was a way of life. He showed that true leadership is not about living above the people, but among them, feeling their struggles, and sharing their burdens. The Prophet Muhammad also understood the weight of emotional pain, not just his own, but the pain carried by those around him. He listened when people spoke, giving them his full attention, as if their story was the only one that mattered. When a young boy who had a pet bird came to him in sadness because the bird had died, the Prophet didn't dismiss it as a small matter. He comforted the child, spoke to him gently, and acknowledged his grief. Even in the smallest sorrows, he recognized the depth of human emotion. He taught that a kind word could be an act of charity, that a smile could heal a wound unseen, and that dignity should be given to everyone, rich or poor, young or old, friend or stranger. This is why people followed him, not only because of his message, but because of his heart. He showed that you can change the world, not only through great speeches or battles won, but through small, consistent acts of love and compassion.